In a world where the dead refused to stay buried, the air hung heavy with the stench of decay. The Georgia sun beat down on grassless stretches of scorched soil where cities once stood, their skeletons now carved by the relentless march of the walkers. Life had become a feverish attempt to survive each day, with the shadows of both the dead and the living casting their own unique threats. Yet, in the middle of this desolation, where choosing survival meant confronting horrors head-on, there remained pockets of humanity bridled by fear and indecision, often under the rule of cruelty that seemed unavoidable in the apocalypse. What if Carol hadn't had the courage to leave Ed? The argument came in whispers, barely audible over the sharp crack of kindling being split with repetitive, angry force. Carol's hands trembled on the hatchet. Her palms, blistered and raw, clenched the handle so tightly that her knuckles burned. She struck the log again, watching it splinter. Not in the clean, efficient way she hoped, but haphazardly, the pieces clinging together like cracks in her resolve. "I said enough." Ed reached out and yanked the handle from her hand. The sudden loss of weight in her grip jolted her slightly backward. "You hear me, Carol? You're wasting wood, and we've got none to spare." I thought I'd try to get ahead for tomorrow," she stammered, her voice as soft and apologetic as ever. She lowered her gaze, her shoulders curling inward like a shield. Ed's lip curled in irritation. The edges of his mouth still bore crumbs from the last of their hardening bread stash, food Carol hadn't tasted in 3 days. His bulk, once intimidating in his sedentary cruelty, had shrunk slightly since the Walker outbreak. His mean streak, however, had grown sharper. Smaller men in bigger worlds clawed for dominance when the safety of order disintegrated. "You're always thinking ahead like I'm not already keeping us alive," Ed said, sneering. "Don't flatter yourself. You think you've got it so bad? I don't see you out there, putting your neck on the line. Maybe you should be grateful I haven't tossed you to those things out there yet." Carol knew better than to argue. It was how she got through most days. Lowered eyes, slumped shoulders, silence. If she focused hard enough, she could tune out the storm of his words, the way his voice grated like 1,000 tiny knives descending all at once. If she tried even harder, she could almost forget the bruises hidden beneath her sweater. Dark blue pools blooming on her arms, reminders of the nights her silence wasn't deemed convincing enough. Sophia, sitting cross-legged against the faded yellow siding of the collapsed gas station they were temporarily sheltering in, barely raised her head as the scene unfolded. She knew, as well as Carol, where arguing escalated. A child learned fast in a world where safety came second to survival. She picked aimlessly at the chipped paint with fingers caked in dirt. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth pressed in a tight line. It was hard to picture the little girl she had once been. A child who smiled at wildflowers and laughed with her mother in a life now impossible to reclaim. Slowly, the light had drained from her, much like it had from Carol. This was supposed to have been Rick Grimes' group's camp. But in this version of events, Carol never worked up the courage to break away. The group had splintered months earlier, fractured by bad blood when Ed made one power grab too many. He'd claimed their resources and their camp, using a mixture of deceit and violence to drive away those who wouldn't tolerate him. It had cost them Rick. It had cost them Daryl and Glenn and Maggie. Lori and Carl had disappeared in the fallout. It had cost them a chance at something Carol had never dared hope for in her life: community. Carol was now left with Ed's rotting authority and whoever was desperate enough to stay under his brutish methods rather than take their chances on the road. Ed dropped the hatchet next to Carol's feet with a sharp clatter. She flinched at the sound. "Go clean up this mess," he commanded, gesturing broadly to the pile of uneven wood chunks. "And quit wasting time. You're more trouble than you're worth." He turned his back on her, returning to where two of the other men, equally browbeaten but eager to stay in Ed's good graces, tended to a jury-rigged perimeter fence made of scavenged barbed wire and scrap metal. The walkers would breach it when enough numbers pressed against it, but Ed didn't want to hear it. That was tomorrow's problem, he'd said. Carol often wondered if Ed understood that in the apocalypse, there wasn't much of a tomorrow to count on. Carol picked up the axe with shaking hands and began to clear away the firewood, dread burrowing into her chest. Her eyes flitted to Sophia, whose blank stare made her ache in a way that no bruises ever could. "You doing okay, baby?" Carol whispered, keeping her voice soft enough that Ed wouldn't hear. Sophia flicked her eyes upward just long enough to nod, but it was hollow and muted. Hopelessness had sunk deep into the girl, just as it had into her mother. Carol swallowed hard. She ought to do something, say something, but what was left to offer in a world like this? Words wouldn't bring back the group they'd lost. Words wouldn't make Ed disappear or give Sophia the safety and normalcy she deserved. And words, Carol knew, wouldn't make her brave. Not the way she needed to be. Later that night, as the camp lights dimmed and the walkers began their eerie nocturnal moaning from just outside the makeshift barricades, Carol lay curled against Sophia on the ground. Their thin blanket barely staved off the late autumn chill seeping into the cracked concrete. Ed snored loudly on the other side of the gas station. Carol stared up at the hem of her sweater as it clung uselessly to her trembling frame. The faint scrape of her daughter's breathing was the only thing tethering her to this moment, proving she was still alive, still here. But it wasn't enough. Inside her chest was an aching emptiness, a longing for something better than the infinitesimal misery she and Sophia endured day after day. She thought of Lori, the only other woman who had known what it was to protect a child through all this. She thought of Daryl, wordlessly helpful in his awkward, gruff way. She thought of Rick and his impossible hope, the way he kept trying to rebuild something that resembled humanity. Her mind twisted on the word like a knife. Humanity. It wasn't just about surviving. It was who you could still be when the world fell apart. Could Ed even claim to be alive anymore? He embodied nothing but rage and cruelty. Walkers walked, but Ed hadn't been truly living in years. This realization sat heavy in her chest, threatening to crack her resolve. To acknowledge it was to look in the mirror and ask herself if she had become as lifeless as him in her desperation to stay safe. That was when the wall gave way with a deafening crash. Carol jolted up, clutching Sophia instinctively to her chest. The fence hadn't been enough. The walkers poured in through the gaps in a bone-snapping shuffle of rotted limbs. Screams erupted as the camp's inhabitants fumbled for weapons. Ed's voice boomed over the chaos, barking orders and reaching for his shotgun. But within moments, he was gone. His shouting dissolved into gurgled cries as 3 walkers clawed him to the dirt. Carol didn't stop to mourn. She stumbled to her feet, dragging Sophia behind her. All around them, survivors screamed, fought, or froze while the dead tore into their flesh. Blood sprayed in crimson arcs against the pale yellow walls. Carol grabbed a rusted screwdriver from the ground, a pitiful weapon by any measure, and plunged it into the skull of an advancing walker with a feral scream, her muscles shaking as its body crumpled violently against her. This wasn't the first time she'd killed a walker, but something about this moment felt different. Ed had always been standing over her shoulder, controlling her movements, her life. For the first time, his shadow wasn't commanding her to stay in place. She could leave. She could run. She tightened her grip on Sophia's hand, breathless urgency sweeping through her as she ducked and weaved through the chaos, stepping over dying men and pressing past women too terrified to move. She didn't let herself look back at Ed. By the time they escaped the horde and stumbled into the woods beyond the gas station, the night had darkened into an impenetrable blackness. Carol turned to Sophia, both of them panting for air. "Look at me," she said, her voice trembling as she lowered herself to Sophia's level. Her hands cupped the girl's tear-streaked cheeks. "You're okay. We're okay." Sophia hiccuped softly, nodding even as her lower lip quivered. Carol might have broken apart right there if she couldn't feel the faint pulse of her daughter's wrist beat against her palm. She realized something as the oppressive night loomed around them, growing silent without Ed's constant presence. She was free, not of the walkers, not of the fight, but of him. The man who had suffocated every ounce of light she had left had been taken by the monsters of the world she feared most, and she hadn't mourned his loss. Instead, she'd run. And for the first time in years, that felt like a victory as the forest wrapped its dark arms around them. The rhythmic rustling of leaves in the cold wind was broken only by the occasional distant groan of a walker. Carol's chest rose and fell rapidly, her ears straining to pick apart every sound. Each snap of a twig and every whisper of movement could mean death or worse now. She gripped Sophia's hand tighter. The night felt enormous and consuming out there in the wilderness. A gibbous moon hung almost hidden behind the clouds, casting meager light on the uneven forest floor. Carol tried to quiet her breathing, listening more intently than she ever had before. But the woods were alive with noise, no longer the peaceful kind she remembered from her old life. The gas station was behind them now, its thin shelter and its atrocities swallowed by the horde. The memory of Ed's death flashed in her thoughts. The rough scream as he went down, the walkers' mouths tearing through him as if the man were no more than sinew and flesh, stripped of his power, his hatred, his voice. For so long, Ed had been God in her life, an angry tyrant, smiting her with calloused hands and cruel words. All of that had ended in an instant, gone. Just like that, he had been reduced to nothing more than food for the dead. The thought should have brought her relief, but instead, it filled her with something far more confusing: guilt. And yet, how could she mourn him, really? Would it matter to Sophia if she knew what her mother felt, or didn't feel? What Carol did know was that with Ed's absence came a gaping, terrifying openness. She'd spent so many years doing everything under his thumb, keeping her head down, her words soft, her hands busy, her pain buried. Now she was left wondering who she even was without him. Could she keep Sophia alive without someone standing over her, telling her how small and useless she was? She glanced back at Sophia, who trudged behind her, her small legs struggling to keep up. The girl was silent, but her chest hitched with quiet, hiccuping sobs. Dirt and blood smudged her soft face, and her cheeks glistened with thin trails from fresh tears. This wasn't the first time Sophia had cried for one kind of monster or another, but tonight her tears felt heavier, more permanent. Carol knelt down as softly as she could, brushing her daughter's hair back with trembling fingers. "Sophia," she whispered, her own voice unsteady. I know tonight was scary, but I need you to listen to me, baby. No more freezing up when bad things happen, okay? We can't freeze anymore." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her. The truth was, she wasn't sure she could practice what she preached. She wasn't sure if she wasn't frozen herself. Just moving through this forest felt like dragging herself through syrup. Sophia nodded slowly, her eyes wide and enormous in the moonlight. There were no words of comfort left between them. Really, not here. Words wouldn't stitch them into safety. They wouldn't make the past go away. But they had each other for now, and that would have to be enough. Carol forced herself onward, pulling Sophia by the hand. They moved through the undergrowth, avoiding the larger, open stretches of forest where moonlight spilled. She led them deeper into the woods, blisters burning on her feet, exhaustion racking every part of her body. She had no plan. There was no safe place left, no clear path ahead. Every moment was simply about moving forward, staying ahead of whatever inevitable threat might rise up next. After what felt like hours, Sophia stumbled and fell, her weight dragging Carol to a sudden halt. "Mama," she whispered, her voice weak. She stayed on her knees, gripping Carol's arm as if the ground beneath her might give way. I can't keep going." Carol scooped Sophia into her arms. Every muscle in her body protested. She was too small, too weak for this. But she couldn't stop. The guilt swallowed her whole for letting Sophia live this way, for failing to protect her from every kind of misery and pain in this godforsaken world. As humiliating as it was to admit, she didn't know if she could keep them alive. She wasn't Rick, not with his plans and structures. She wasn't Daryl, not with his quiet efficiency and survivalist instincts. She wasn't Lori or Maggie or Andrea, not even close. In her good moments, she'd been someone who tried. And in her weakest, she had allowed herself to trudge on, afraid of every shadow, every obstacle, every moment just like this. But this fight, this sheer force of will, it was more than she'd ever thought herself capable of. Sophia's weight in her arms wasn't only a burden. It was a reminder. She wasn't the same woman who had walked out of her old life holding bruises under her sweater and one ear tuned to Ed's voice. She was something new now. She couldn't name it yet, but it was there, pulsing just beneath her skin, waiting for her to let herself see it. Somewhere nearby, walkers groaned. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Carol's adrenaline spiked immediately. She hugged Sophia tighter to her chest, turned, and started moving again. Her breath came sharp and shallow, her legs trembling not just from fear but from near-total exhaustion. She could feel sleep trying to burrow into her with every step, hunger eating the last of her energy. Finally, just as her knees threatened to give out, she stumbled into a small clearing. The forest opened up to reveal an ancient hunting cabin, nearly unseen in the dark. It was barely standing, a structure of warped wood and missing shingles, but it had walls. Walls and a door. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was enough of a chance to dig in, to survive. Carol made her way to the door cautiously. She nudged it open with one foot, the wood creaking noisily into the still night. Her blood burned with tension, waiting for movement or sound inside. A walker hidden in its rotting shell. But nothing came, just silence. She stepped inside, the loose floorboards groaning under her weight. The interior was sparse and thick with the smell of mildew, but it would suffice. She laid Sophia down on an old cot in the corner, brushing the girl's matted hair with careful fingers. Sophia's eyes cracked open, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. They were safe for now. As Carol sat beside her daughter in that darkened hunting cabin, she caught her own image in a cracked mirror hanging above a rusted sink. What she saw startled her. Her face was gaunt and streaked with grime, her cheekbones more pronounced than she remembered. She looked more like a survivor than she ever pictured herself being. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to that. As Sophia's breathing slowed and the faintest hints of dawn began to edge their way into the dark, Carol felt something settle in her chest. She wouldn't ever forgive herself for waiting as long as she had to leave Ed. She might never forgive herself for the pieces of this world she had let crumble around her. But Ed was gone, and she was still here, standing taller tonight than he'd ever let her. And as long as Sophia lived, she would find a way to crawl forward. You didn't have to be Rick to lead. You didn't even have to be brave. You just had to keep going. The dawn came grudgingly, fighting its way through the dense forest canopy, where every crack of light seemed like an intrusion into a world trying to forget what morning looked like. Carol's eyes fluttered open to find Sophia curled tightly against her side. The girl's breathing was steady now, less labored than it had been. The lines of pain and exhaustion etched so deeply into her young face the night before had softened just enough to remind Carol of what Sophia once was. Before the walkers, before Ed. A child. Her child. The one thing in this broken world still worth fighting for. But fighting, as Carol had come to learn, required more than just will. It required resources. Their stomachs had groaned loudly in the silence of the night. They had no water beyond a few sips left in an old plastic bottle she'd scavenged days ago. No food. Sophia's shoes were barely holding together after months of use, the rubber soles flapping slightly as she walked. Carol had seen walkers less tattered than the two of them. They couldn't stay here long, not without supplies. Carol rose from the cot as silently as she could, her body protesting with every move. The cabin was colder than she'd expected, its thin walls doing little against the chill of the early morning. She cast one final glance at Sophia, who remained sound asleep, her face turned toward the musty cot's rotting wood frame. Carol hesitated. It had been so long since Sophia had gotten a moment of true rest, and she didn't want to wake her. Not yet. As much as it scared Carol to leave her, even for a few minutes, it seemed worth the risk to search the tiny interior of the cabin for anything useful. She moved methodically, her breathing shallow as she opened each cupboard one by one. Most of them were empty, except for a few rodent droppings and thick coats of dust that clung to her fingers. Beneath the sink, she found a rusted tin can with no label, its contents unknown. She pocketed it for later, feeling an almost shameful sense of gratitude even as she grimaced. Hunger turned choice into luxury. Her search turned up little else. A broken hunting knife, its blade dulled with age but still sharp enough for close encounters if necessary. A scattering of old blankets stored in a moldy trunk, far too heavy to carry but useful for tonight, should they stay. She found no weapons worth wielding, no extra food, no water. And yet, despite the disappointment, Carol felt an odd sense of accomplishment. For once, she had made a decision without Ed or anyone else looming over her. She had seen a problem, a need, and taken the steps alone to address it. Even with such meager rewards, the act itself felt significant. Small, yes, but significant. Each day now demanded proof of her ability to survive, and even a day like today, where victory came in the shape of an unmarked tin can, gave her something to hold on to. Sophia stirred as Carol returned to her place near the cot. The girl rubbed her eyes with her fists, slowly coming back to the world's layered noises, the distant caws of birds, the whisper of wind against leaves, the faint and ever-present moaning far off in the woods. Carol knelt beside her, brushing stray hair from her daughter's face. "Morning, sweetie," she murmured so. "Vtly." Sophia blinked up at her, her voice hoarse from disuse. "We're still here." It wasn't exactly a question, more of an observation weighted with profound surprise. Carol stiffened slightly, unsure what to make of it. Over the past several weeks, months, really, she had tried to shield Sophia from the worst truths of the world, only to realize too late that children had a way of understanding things adults refused to say out loud. It wasn't fear she heard in Sophia's voice, though. It was disbelief. "We're still here," Carol confirmed with a quiet strength she wasn't sure she believed. "That counts for something." Sophia nodded faintly and sat up, clutching her knees to her chest. She scanned the small room with tired eyes before speaking again. "Did he?" She trailed off, not daring to speak Ed's name. Carol paused, her hand resting instinctively over Sophia's. "He's gone," she said at last. "We don't have to worry about him anymore." Sophia's lips twitched, forming something halfway between a frown and relief. She didn't press her mother for details, and Carol didn't offer them. There was no space left in this world for grief over a man like Ed, and perhaps the truest mercy she could give her daughter was leaving him behind in every way that mattered. The day stretched outward in cautious uncertainty. Carol and Sophia remained holed up in the cabin a few more hours, catching rest where they could and rationing the last of the water. By mid-morning, Carol decided it would be too dangerous to stay the night in one place again. Sooner or later, the walkers would sniff them out, or worse, living raiders might stumble upon the cabin the same way they had. The air was always thick in her lungs with that possibility. They ventured out near noon, the once golden sun now a pale yellow disk shrouded by clouds that rolled low and heavy over the forest. Carol moved quietly with Sophia close at her side, their every step placed deliberately to avoid crunching on stray branches. Walkers wandered through the woods, keeping to the shadows and casting long, warped silhouettes among the trees. Carol's hand tightened around her makeshift knife, her knuckles white. In the back of her mind, she heard Rick's voice from the earlier days of the group, giving instructions on how to clear their perimeter or fight in close quarters. His calm resolve had always impressed her. He didn't flinch when walkers got too close, didn't falter when the weight of leadership pressed down heavy. But for all his planning, Carol had never resented him. He gave people purpose, and she understood now, stumbling through the woods, how purpose meant survival. Sophia suddenly grabbed her sleeve, stopping her mid-step. "Mama," she whispered urgently, pointing to a spot ahead where flattened grass and snapped twigs suggested something, or someone had passed recently. Carol's throat tightened as her gaze followed the path, her mind warring between hope and fear. Only the living left tracks like that. But the living weren't always safer than the dead. "Stay behind me," Carol murmured, positioning herself protectively in front of Sophia. Every noise around them became amplified. The rustling leaves, the faint wind, the distant crack of a branch. She motioned for Sophia to crouch against the twisted spine of a fallen tree while she crept forward to investigate. The path led her to a small clearing, its center littered with the remains of a camp. Torn bags spilled their contents across the ground. A map here, scraps of clothing there. A fire pit long extinguished sat in the middle, its faint ash stirring in the breeze. Carol bent down, her fingers brushing the items, looking for anything useful. Most of it was shredded beyond recognition, but a canteen, dented but full, caught her attention, along with a small knife caked in dried blood. The former owner, whoever they'd been, was nowhere to be seen. Whether they'd fallen to walkers or had moved on without their belongings, she couldn't say. But the missing body struck her as eerie. If it had been walkers, there would have been remains strewn about, blood, bones, something. Instead, the site was almost too cleanly abandoned, empty and quiet in a way that made her stomach churn. She hurried back to Sophia, who had remained perfectly still, her wide eyes darting nervously toward every shifting shadow. "We have to move," Carol whispered, holding up the canteen and knife to acknowledge her find before tucking them away. "Why?" Sophia asked, her voice more direct than cautious now. "Because whoever left this camp might come back," Carol said simply. "And they might not be friendly." Sophia fell silent and nodded, taking her mother's hand. Together they retreated deeper into the woods, where the air grew damper and the trees denser. As they moved, Carol found herself rehearsing the worst-case scenarios in her head. What if they walked into another dead-end cabin, surrounded by walkers before they could escape? What if raiders, or worse, someone like Ed, found them first? What if her decisions weren't enough to keep Sophia alive another day? But those thoughts, as overwhelming as they were interrupted by Sophia tugging at her side, forcing her attention back to the present. "Over there," the girl whispered, pointing toward a gap in the trees. Carol froze, her breath catching as she spotted movement. 3 walkers staggered in the distance, their sluggish shuffling taking them further away rather than toward the small trail Sophia had noticed. Relief swept through her. They hadn't been seen, hadn't been heard, but her grip on her daughter's hand remained firm. This was their reality now. Always moving, hiding, watching, surviving. Carol didn't know where exactly they were heading or what might come next. But she kept her eyes forward and her feet moving, matching step for step with Sophia. Every day that the two of them stayed together, alive against all odds, was a victory in itself. And if it wasn't hope they carried, it was something stronger. Sheer determination. For now, Carol Smith wasn't running from anyone anymore. She was running toward something, even if she couldn't quite see what it was yet.